The chamber was eerily silent, save for the faint hum emanating from the glowing symbols on the walls. Mark and Ethan stood in awe, their flashlights pointed at the intricate symbol carved into the ceiling. Mark traced the design with his eyes, trying to make sense of its meaning. "This has to be some kind of message," he muttered. "Something ancient. But why would the creature lead us here?" Ethan crossed his arms, his unease evident. "Maybe it's not leading us. It's trapping us. Ever think about that?" Before Mark could respond, the creature stepped onto the platform and placed its massive hand against the largest stone carving. A low rumble echoed through the chamber as the floor beneath them began to shift. "Mark, what's happening?" Ethan shouted, stumbling backward as the ground trembled. Mark steadied himself, his heart pounding. "I don't know, but stay close." The platform descended like an ancient elevator, revealing a staircase spiraling deeper into the earth. The creature stepped off the platform and gestured for them to follow. Ethan hesitated, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "This is insane. We should turn back while we still can." Mark turned to him, his voice calm but firm. "We've come this far, Ethan. Whatever's down there, it's the reason for everything. The sightings, the symbols, the fear. Don't you want to know the truth?" Ethan hesitated, then sighed heavily. "Fine, but if I get eaten by some ancient monster, I'm blaming you." The two men followed the creature down the staircase, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were lined with more symbols, their glow pulsating faintly as if alive. At the bottom of the staircase, they entered a vast underground cavern. It was unlike anything they'd ever seen. Towering stone pillars reached toward the ceiling, and a massive pool of water lay at the center, its surface glowing with an otherworldly light. Ethan stared in disbelief. "What is this place?" Mark stepped forward, his eyes wide. "It's like an underground sanctuary. But for what?" The creature moved to the edge of the glowing pool and gestured for them to approach. Mark and Ethan exchanged a nervous glance before cautiously stepping closer. As they neared the pool, they saw their reflections shimmer and distort on its surface. Suddenly, the water began to ripple, and an image formed, a scene of dense forests and snowy peaks. Mark's breath caught. "It's showing us something." The image shifted, revealing glimpses of other creatures, some resembling the ones standing before them, others entirely alien in form. They moved through the forests, their massive frames blending seamlessly with the landscape. Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're not just one creature, there are more of them." Mark nodded, his mind racing. "This isn't just a sanctuary, it's a gateway, a connection to their world." The creature growled softly, drawing their attention. It pointed to the pool, then to the symbol on the ceiling, as if urging them to understand. Mark furrowed his brow, piecing together the fragments of the mystery. The symbols, the sightings, everything. It's all tied to this place. They've been protecting it, keeping it hidden from the world. Ethan shook his head, his fear replaced by a growing sense of wonder. But why? What are they afraid of? Before Mark could respond, a distant sound echoed through the cavern, the faint hum of engines. Ethan froze. "Do you hear that?" Mark nodded, his stomach sinking. "It's a helicopter." The creature let out a low growl, its glowing eyes narrowing as it turned toward the entrance. It crouched low, its muscles tensed as if preparing for a fight. Ethan grabbed Mark's arm. "They found us. We have to get out of here." But Mark shook his head, his gaze fixed on the creature. "No, this place isn't safe anymore. They'll destroy it if they find it." The creature growled again, more urgently this time. It gestured toward the pool, then to Mark and Ethan, as if urging them to make a decision. Mark took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We have to help it protect this place. If they find it, everything we've seen, everything we've learned, it'll be lost forever." Ethan stared at him, his expression torn. "And what if we can't stop them?" Mark's jaw tightened. "Then we'll go down fighting." The faint hum of engines grew louder, reverberating through the cavern. Mark and Ethan exchanged a tense glance, their hearts pounding. The creature crouched low, its glowing eyes fixed on the staircase leading back to the surface. It growled deeply, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. Mark grabbed Ethan's shoulder. "We need to move. If the rescue team finds this place, they'll report it, and who knows what will happen after that." Ethan hesitated, his voice shaky. "And do what? Fight them off? There's no way we can take on a team of trained professionals." The creature let out a sharp, guttural sound, cutting through their argument. It gestured toward the pool, then pointed to the staircase. Mark's eyes widened as he realized what it was trying to say. It's telling us to lead them away, to buy it time to protect this place. Ethan's face paled. You're kidding, right? You want us to be bait? Mark nodded grimly. It's the only way. We've seen too much, Ethan. If we don't help, this place will be exposed. Ethan swallowed hard, the fear evident in his eyes. But after a moment, he nodded reluctantly. Fine. Let's do this. The two men sprinted up the staircase, their flashlights bouncing wildly. The engine's hum grew louder as they emerged from the structure into the dense forest. A spotlight swept through the trees, illuminating their surroundings in harsh white light. Mark and Ethan dove into the underbrush, their breathing ragged. Ethan whispered, "They're already here. What now?" Mark peered through the foliage, spotting the faint outline of a helicopter hovering above the treetops. He pointed to the left. "We head that way. Make noise, draw their attention." Ethan's expression was a mix of fear and disbelief. "You're insane." Mark gave him a faint smile. "Maybe, but it'll work." The two friends began running through the forest, deliberately snapping branches and shouting. The sound of boots hitting the ground told them their plan was working. "Over here!" one of the voices called out. "I heard something!" Mark and Ethan pushed themselves harder, adrenaline surging through their veins. The spotlight from the helicopter swung in their direction, forcing them to dive behind a fallen log. Ethan gasped for breath. "This is the worst idea you've ever had." Mark peeked over the log, his heart racing. "It's working. They're following us. We just need to keep them away from the cavern." Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the forest. A tranquilizer dart embedded itself in the log inches from Mark's head. "They're armed," Ethan hissed, panic creeping into his voice. Mark grabbed his arm. "Then we don't stop moving. Come on!" The chase continued deeper into the forest, the search team closing in. Mark and Ethan's lungs burned, their legs aching as they pushed themselves to the limit. Just as they thought they couldn't go any further, a deafening roar echoed through the trees. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the creature burst into view, its massive form barreling toward the search team. The men shouted in alarm, their flashlights and weapons turning toward the creature. But it was too fast, too powerful. It knocked them aside effortlessly, its guttural growl filling the air. Mark and Ethan watched in awe as the creature defended its territory. Ethan whispered, "It's protecting us." Mark nodded, his voice filled with wonder. "No, it's protecting the secret." The search team retreated, their shouts fading into the distance. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes scanning the forest. Mark and Ethan approached cautiously, their breaths still labored. "Thank you," Mark said softly. The creature turned to them, its expression unreadable. It gestured toward the forest, a silent command to leave. Ethan frowned. "It wants us to go." Mark nodded. "Our part is done. It's up to us to make sure this stays buried." Reluctantly, they turned and began their journey back to the edge of the forest, the weight of what they'd witnessed pressing heavily on their shoulders. Mark and Ethan trudged through the dense forest, their bodies aching and minds reeling from the night's events. The creature's roar still echoed faintly in their ears, a haunting reminder of the powerful force they had encountered. Ethan broke the silence, his voice shaky. "We should have stayed, helped it more." Mark shook his head. "We did what we could. If we stayed any longer, we'd have been captured. Or worse." Ethan sighed, kicking at the underbrush. "I just can't believe it. That thing protected us. It could have left us to deal with those guys, but it didn't." Mark glanced at his friend, his expression solemn. It wasn't just protecting us. It was protecting its home, its world. We were just a small part of something much bigger. As they walked, the forest began to thin, revealing the faint outlines of a dirt road. Mark pulled out his compass, checking their direction. "We're close to where we parked?" he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. Ethan groaned. "Finally, I feel like I've aged 10 years in one night." When they reached the road, the sight of their dusty pickup truck brought a wave of relief. They climbed in, slamming the doors behind them. Ethan leaned back in his seat, staring at the ceiling. "What now? Do we just go back to our lives and pretend none of this happened?" Mark started the engine, the truck rumbling to life. "We can't tell anyone, Ethan. You saw what they were willing to do to find that place. If word gets out, it'll be chaos. Ethan frowned. But what about the truth? People deserve to know what's out there. Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly. And then what? Scientists, governments, treasure hunters, they'd all descend on that forest. They'd destroy it. That creature, its home, everything. Gone. Is that what you want? Ethan was silent for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. No, I don't want that. Mark nodded, his expression resolute. Then we keep this between us. No one else can know. The drive back to their small town was quiet, the weight of their secret hanging heavy in the air. When they arrived, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, casting the streets in a soft, golden light. Ethan turned to Mark as they pulled into his driveway. So, we just act like nothing happened? Go back to work? Hang out like usual? Mark forced a small smile. Something like that, but we'll always know, Ethan. We'll always know what's out there. Ethan nodded, stepping out of the truck. Take care, man. And thanks for not letting me lose it out there. Mark gave him a nod. Same to you. As Mark drove home, his mind raced with thoughts of the cavern, the glowing pool, and the creature that had saved them. He knew their lives would never truly be the same, but he also knew they had made the right choice. The secret would stay with them, hidden deep in the forests where it belonged. But deep down, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Days turned into weeks, but the events of that fateful night stayed vivid in Mark and Ethan's minds. They returned to their routine, work, coffee meetups, and the occasional weekend fishing trip, but an unspoken tension lingered between them. Ethan couldn't stop replaying the encounter in his head. The glowing eyes of the creature, the roar that shook the earth, the way it seemed to understand their intentions. He'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the creature was still out there, protecting its home. Mark, on the other hand, had thrown himself into work, trying to bury his thoughts under a pile of projects. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the memories. He found himself scanning the news, searching for any mention of strange happenings in the forest, half hoping and half dreading to see something. One evening, as they sat on Mark's back porch with beers in hand, Ethan broke the silence. Have you thought about going back? He asked hesitantly. Mark stiffened. We agreed not to, Ethan. It's too dangerous. I know, Ethan said quickly. But don't you want to check to make sure it's okay? Mark shook his head, taking a long sip of his beer. The less we interfere, the better. That creature knows how to handle itself. We'd just be putting it and ourselves at risk. Ethan looked unconvinced but didn't push the issue. Instead, he leaned back and stared at the stars. It just feels wrong, like we left something unfinished. Mark sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Sometimes the best thing you can do is leave things as they are. Later that night, as Mark lay in bed, he heard a faint rustling outside his window. Sitting up, he strained his ears, his heart pounding. The sound came again, soft, deliberate, like someone, or something, moving through the yard. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the cool night air sending a shiver down his spine. Hello? He called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The yard was empty, the trees casting long, eerie shadows under the moonlight. But as he turned to go back inside, he spotted something on the ground near the edge of the forest. A footprint. Not human. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The print was massive, with claw-like impressions at the toes. He crouched down, his mind racing. Was it the creature? Had it come to find him? Or was it something else entirely? The next morning, Mark showed the footprint to Ethan, who immediately grew pale. That's it, isn't it? Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. The creature. Mark nodded grimly. I think so. But why would it come here? We're miles away from the forest. Ethan frowned, his mind working through the possibilities. Maybe it's trying to warn us, or maybe it needs our help. Mark ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. If it's here, it's not good news. We need to be careful. Ethan nodded, his expression serious. So what do we do? Mark looked out toward the forest, a sense of foreboding settling over him. We wait, and if it shows itself, we'll figure it out then. The following days were marked by a growing unease. Mark and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. At night, faint sounds drifted through the air, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional low growl that set their nerves on edge. Mark became increasingly vigilant, keeping a flashlight and a makeshift weapon, a sturdy metal bat by his side at all times. Ethan, on the other hand, began leaving out scraps of food near the edge of the forest, hoping to coax the creature closer. "It's not a dog, Ethan," Mark said one evening, watching his friend place an apple and a slice of bread on the ground. "I know that," Ethan replied, glancing into the trees. "But if it's here, it's for a reason. Maybe this will show we mean no harm." Mark sighed, skeptical but too tired to argue. The next morning, the food was gone. In its place was a small, carefully arranged stack of sticks, forming a rudimentary symbol. Mark stared at it, his jaw tightening. "It's communicating." Ethan crouched beside the symbol, tracing it with his finger. "But what does it mean?" Mark shook his head. "No idea. But this is more than just instinct. It's intelligent." Ethan looked up at him, his eyes wide. "So what do we do now?" Mark thought for a moment before responding. "We leave another message. Something simple. Let's see if it responds." They spent the afternoon arranging rocks into a basic arrow shape pointing toward the forest. The act felt almost absurd, but they were desperate for answers. That night, as they sat on Mark's porch, the atmosphere was tense. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow more ominous. Around midnight, a distant howl broke the silence. It was low and guttural, unlike anything they'd ever heard before. Mark and Ethan exchanged a glance, their hearts racing. "That's not it?" Mark whispered. Ethan swallowed hard. "Then what is it?" The following morning, the rocks were rearranged into a new symbol, a circle with a line slashed through it. Mark stared at the symbol, his mind racing. "It's warning us. Something's coming." Ethan's face paled. "You think it's the search team? Or something worse?" Mark didn't answer. He scanned the forest, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but he knew they were in too deep now. "We need to be ready," he said finally. "Whatever's out there, we're not running this time." The morning fog hung thick in the air as Mark and Ethan prepared for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. They gathered what little supplies they had, flashlights, a hunting knife, a bat, and a small first aid kit, and stayed close to the edge of the forest, their nerves frayed. Ethan couldn't stop glancing at the rearranged rocks. A circle with a line through it. It feels like a warning, but against what? Mark didn't reply immediately. He was too focused on scanning the trees, looking for any movement. "Whatever it's warning us about, it's something we don't want to meet." As the day wore on, the woods seemed to grow darker, despite the rising sun. The air felt heavier, charged with an almost electric energy. Birds and small animals were conspicuously absent, leaving an eerie silence that set Mark and Ethan further on edge. By mid-afternoon, the two friends had retreated to Mark's porch, keeping a wary eye on the forest. "We can't just sit here," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If it's out there, we need to figure out what it is." Mark hesitated, weighing the risks. "We'll go, but only as far as the first clearing. If we see anything or hear anything, we turn back." Ethan nodded, though his expression betrayed his growing fear. The hike into the forest was slow and deliberate, each step measured to avoid breaking twigs or rustling leaves. Mark led the way, his flashlight in hand, even though the sun was still up. They reached the clearing in less than 10 minutes, but what they found stopped them in their tracks. The ground was disturbed, as if something massive had been pacing back and forth. Deep claw marks gouged the trees, and the faint metallic tang of blood hung in the air. Ethan's hand tightened around the hilt of the hunting knife. This wasn't here before. Mark crouched beside one of the claw marks, his brow furrowed. "It's fresh. Whatever did this was here recently." Before they could process further, a low growl rumbled from the trees ahead. It was deep and guttural, vibrating in their chests. Ethan froze. "That's not the creature we saw before." Mark slowly stood, his eyes locked on the dense undergrowth. "No, it's not." The growl grew louder, closer, until a massive figure emerged from the shadows. It was larger than the creature they had encountered before, with glowing red eyes and a body covered in matted black fur. Its teeth gleamed as it bared them, letting out a roar that sent birds scattering from the treetops. Ethan took a step back, his breathing ragged. "What do we do, Mark?" Mark tightened his grip on the bat, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "We don't run. We stand our ground." The creature stepped closer, its movements deliberate and predatory. Mark and Ethan braced themselves, knowing this confrontation could end very badly. And then, from the shadows behind them, another figure appeared. It was the original creature, the one they had encountered in the cavern. Its glowing blue eyes locked onto the red-eyed beast, and it let out a roar of its own. Ethan's voice trembled as he whispered, "They're not alone." Mark and Ethan stood frozen as the two creatures faced off. The air seemed to crackle with tension, their guttural growls reverberating through the forest like a warning. The red-eyed beast crouched low, its massive frame shifting with raw power. Its claws dug into the earth as it snarled, saliva dripping from its gaping maw. The blue-eyed creature, smaller but no less intimidating, stood its ground. Its posture was defensive but resolute, its piercing gaze locked on its opponent. Mark whispered, "It's protecting us." Ethan's grip on the knife trembled. "What do we do? We can't just stand here." Mark didn't answer. He knew that any sudden movement could provoke the red-eyed beast, and their best chance of survival lay in staying as still as possible. The red-eyed creature lunged first, its roar splitting the air. The blue-eyed protector met it head-on, their bodies colliding with a force that shook the ground beneath Mark and Ethan's feet. The two creatures grappled, claws slashing and teeth snapping, their growls and roars echoing through the forest. Branches broke and dirt flew as they thrashed, their struggle primal and ferocious. Mark grabbed Ethan's arm. "We need to move. Now." Ethan hesitated, his eyes glued to the battle. What if it loses? That thing will come for us next. Mark pulled him harder. "We can't help it. We'll only get in the way. Come on!" Reluctantly, Ethan followed as they retreated deeper into the trees, their hearts pounding. The sounds of the fight grew fainter as they put distance between themselves and the creatures. Mark led them to a small rocky outcrop, where they crouched, catching their breath. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow. "Do you think it can win?" Mark shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know, but if it doesn't, we'll need to be far away from here." As they waited, the forest fell eerily silent. The absence of sound was almost more unnerving than the fight itself. And then a deep, pained roar shattered the quiet. Ethan's eyes widened. That didn't sound good. Mark's jaw tightened. "We need to keep moving. If the red-eyed one wins, it'll track us. And if the blue-eyed one wins," he hesitated, "it might still come after us." Suddenly, a familiar rustling sound came from the trees behind them. Both men whipped around, their weapons at the ready. The blue-eyed creature emerged, its fur matted with blood, but its posture steady. It regarded them with an intense, almost knowing look. Mark lowered the bat slightly. It won. Ethan took a cautious step forward. "Is it hurt?" The creature didn't move closer. Instead, it let out a low rumble, not a growl, but something softer. Its gaze lingered on them for a moment longer before it turned and disappeared into the forest. Mark exhaled shakily. "It saved us. Again." Ethan nodded, his voice hushed. "But why? Why protect us?" Mark didn't have an answer. All he knew was that their encounter with these creatures was far from over. Mark and Ethan stood in silence, staring into the forest where the blue-eyed creature had vanished. The weight of the encounter pressed heavily on their minds. Ethan broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "It could have attacked us. It didn't. Why?" Mark shook his head, his grip tightening on the bat. "Maybe it's smarter than we think. Maybe it knows we're not a threat. But it's more than that, Mark." Ethan's eyes flicked back to the clearing. "It's like it understands us." Mark sighed, his gaze scanning the darkened trees. "Whatever the reason, we're alive. Let's not waste that." They returned to the campsite cautiously, their senses heightened with every step. When they arrived, they found the area untouched, except for one unsettling detail. The symbol of the circle with the line through it had been altered. A smaller circle had been added inside, creating a target-like shape. Mark frowned as he crouched to inspect it. "It's a message, but is it from the red-eyed one or the blue-eyed one?" Ethan knelt beside him, his hand hovering over the ground. "It's almost like it's watching us, wherever we go." Mark stood abruptly, his jaw set. "We can't stay here. We've been too exposed for too long." Ethan glanced at him, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Where would we go? Back to the car? Or deeper into the forest?" Mark hesitated. Both options carried risks, but staying in one place was no longer viable. "The car. It's our best shot at getting out of here if things go south." As they packed up their gear, the forest seemed alive with unseen eyes. Every crackle of a branch and rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. Ethan paused mid-pack, his gaze fixed on a nearby tree. "Mark, look." Carved into the bark was another symbol, an arrow pointing north. Mark clenched his teeth. "It's hurting us." Ethan's voice wavered. Her or them? Mark didn't answer. He grabbed his pack, slinging it over his shoulder. "We follow it, but we stay sharp. This could be a trap." The trek north was grueling, the forest growing denser with each step. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across their path. Finally, they reached a small clearing where an ancient-looking tree stood at its center. Its roots twisted like claws into the earth, and its gnarled branches stretched toward the darkening sky. At the base of the tree was another symbol, this one larger and more intricate, a spiral with jagged lines radiating outward. Ethan stepped closer, his breath catching. "What is this place?" Mark's stomach churned. "I don't know, but we were brought here for a reason." As they examined the symbol, a low growl echoed through the clearing. Both men froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. Emerging from the shadows was a smaller creature, its fur matted and its eyes a dull yellow. It was different from the others, smaller, weaker, but no less threatening. Mark raised the bat, his knuckles white. "Stay behind me." The creature snarled, its movements erratic as it circled them. Ethan whispered, "It's not alone." From the opposite side of the clearing, another figure emerged, and then another. Mark's heart raced as he counted them. 4 in total, their glowing eyes fixed on the 2 intruders. "We're surrounded," Ethan muttered, his voice trembling. Mark tightened his grip on the bat, his mind racing. "If we go down fighting." Mark and Ethan stood back to back, their breaths shallow as the creatures circled them. The forest seemed to close in, the trees like looming specters. The 4 beasts moved in unison, their glowing yellow eyes narrowing as they bared jagged teeth. "Mark," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible, "I don't think we can fight them off." Mark's grip on the bat tightened. "We don't have a choice. Stay calm, and if they charge, aim for the head." One of the creatures lunged forward but stopped short, snapping its teeth in a clear warning. "They're testing us," Mark muttered, "trying to see if we'll break." Ethan's eyes darted around the clearing, searching for anything that could help. His gaze fell on the ancient tree with the strange symbol at its base. "Mark? The tree. There's something about it." "What about it?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward the tree, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The creatures growled, their heads lowering, but they didn't attack. Mark followed, his bat raised, ready to swing at the slightest movement. The closer they got to the tree, the more the air seemed to hum with energy. The spiral symbol carved into the bark pulsed faintly, as if alive. Ethan reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the symbol. The moment his fingers made contact, the clearing was flooded with an intense, blinding light. The creatures howled, their cries filled with rage and fear as they stumbled backward, retreating into the shadows. "What's happening?" Mark shouted, shielding his eyes. Ethan's voice was strained. "I don't know, but it's driving them away." The light grew brighter, enveloping the entire area. Mark grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him back, away from the tree. When the light finally faded, the creatures were gone, leaving only silence in their wake. The clearing felt different now, calmer, as though the oppressive weight of the forest had been lifted. Mark and Ethan stared at the tree, its once pulsing symbol now dull and lifeless. "What was that?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. Mark shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it was, it saved us." Ethan glanced around nervously. "Do you think they'll come back?" Mark exhaled slowly. "I don't know, but I think we need to keep moving, just in case." As they left the clearing, the forest seemed to guide them, the oppressive atmosphere replaced by an almost surreal calm. Ethan looked over his shoulder one last time. "That light, it wasn't natural, Mark. It felt like something was protecting us." Mark didn't respond. He couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with them yet. The forest grew less dense as Mark and Ethan pushed forward, their exhaustion palpable but overridden by the need to keep moving. The strange calm that had followed the light persisted, almost as if the forest was leading them somewhere. "I think we're close to the car," Ethan said, his voice tinged with relief. Mark nodded, though his expression remained tense. "Let's not get too comfortable. We don't know if they're still out there." The underbrush began to thin, and soon the familiar sight of the gravel parking lot came into view. Their car sat where they had left it, untouched and waiting like a lifeline. Ethan let out a laugh, part disbelief and part joy. We made it. We're actually out of there. Mark didn't share his relief. His eyes scanned the tree line, half expecting a pair of glowing eyes to emerge. Get in the car. Now. Ethan didn't argue. They scrambled into the vehicle, slamming the doors shut. As the engine roared to life, the weight of their ordeal began to settle in. Ethan slumped in his seat, his hands trembling. Do you think anyone will believe us? Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened. No, but that doesn't matter. We know what we saw. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, we do. Mark pulled onto the gravel road, the tires crunching against the rocks. As they drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching them leave. When they returned to their small town, the story spread quickly. Mark and Ethan told friends, family, and even local authorities about their harrowing encounter. As expected, no one believed them. You were just tired, one friend said. Probably saw some animals, and your imagination ran wild. Or maybe you guys were just messing with each other out there, another joked. Even the authorities dismissed their claims. There's no evidence of anything unusual, the sheriff said. You're lucky you didn't get lost for good. Weeks turned into months, and Mark and Ethan stopped talking about what had happened. It wasn't worth the ridicule or the doubts. But the memories lingered, vivid and haunting. Ethan moved out of town shortly after, needing distance from the forest that had nearly consumed them. Mark stayed, though he never returned to the woods. Some nights he would wake in a cold sweat, his dreams filled with glowing eyes and shadowy figures. One day, while cleaning out his truck, Mark found the notebook Ethan had been using during their trip. He flipped through the pages, stopping at a rough sketch Ethan had made, the spiral symbol from the ancient tree. Beneath it, Ethan had written a single word. Why? Mark stared at the page, the question echoing in his mind. Why had they been spared? Why had the creatures let them leave? And what was the purpose of the light that had saved them? He didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain, the forest held secrets that weren't meant to be uncovered. And so, their story ended the way it began, with two friends who dared to seek the truth, only to discover that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The end. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories.